There is a common misconception about empathy that deserves closer examination. Most people assume empathy is simply a personality trait, a natural ability to understand and feel what others are experiencing. But for many empaths, especially those who have gone through too much, empathy becomes something far more complex. It becomes a responsibility they never consciously accepted, yet somehow end up carrying every day. Many empaths begin life believing that their ability to care is their greatest strength. They are the listeners, the peacemakers, the ones who stay late to help, who answer the phone when everyone else ignores it, who absorb tension in a room before a single word is spoken. They become experts at reading emotional signals. They notice the slight change in someone's tone. They recognize disappointment hidden behind a smile. They sense discomfort before it becomes visible. At first, this seems like a gift. People appreciate them. They are needed. They feel useful. They died. Envelop an identity around being the dependable one, the understanding one, the emotionally available one. But there is a danger hidden inside this pattern. The human mind was never designed to carry the emotional weight of an entire community. Yet many empaths attempt exactly that. They unconsciously become emotional storage units for everyone around them. Every problem, every crisis, every disappointment gets placed on their shoulders. Because they are capable of carrying it, people assume they should. Over time, something fascinating begins to happen psychologically. The empath becomes so focused on monitoring the emotional states of others that they stop monitoring their own. This is where emotional exhaustion begins, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual disappearance of self-awareness. They know when everyone else is hurting. They know when everyone else is struggling. But ask them how they are doing, and they often don't have an answer. Not because they are hidden, because they genuinely haven't checked. Their attention has been directed outward for so long that their own needs become background noise. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a form of emotional overextension. The individual's caregiving system becomes permanently activated. Instead of empathy being a choice, it becomes a default operating mode. And anything that operates continuously without recovery eventually breaks down. Think about physical exercise. No athlete trains every muscle every hour of every day. Recovery is considered essential because growth happens during restoration, not constant output. Yet emotionally, many empaths never recover. They give, then give more, then give even more. And when they feel tired, guilty thoughts often appear. I should be stronger. They need me. What if nobody helps them? So they continue. What makes this especially dangerous is that society often rewards the behavior. Self-sacrifice is praised. Endless available. Ability is admired. Being needed feels meaningful. But there is a profound difference between being compassionate and being consumed. One is healthy. The other is unsustainable. Eventually, the empath starts noticing symptoms they cannot explain. They feel exhausted after social interactions. They become emotionally numb in situations where they once felt deeply. Small requests begin to feel overwhelming. Their patience shortens. Their enthusiasm fades. The activities that once brought joy no longer create the same emotional response. This is not because they have become selfish. It is because their emotional resources have been depleted. Imagine withdrawing money from a bank account for years without making deposits. The crisis is not the final withdrawal. The crisis happened long before. The final withdrawal simply revealed what was already true. The same principle applies to emotional energy. Most empaths do not reach exhaustion overnight. They arrive there through the thousands of moments of neglecting themselves in favor of everyone else. And perhaps the most painful part is that very few people notice. The empath notices everyone's struggles. But who notices the empath? Who asks how the helper is doing? Who checks on the person everyone depends on? Often nobody. This realization can be deeply unsettling, because eventually the empath discovers a difficult truth. Many relationships were built upon what they provided rather than who they were. As long as they listened, people stayed. As long as they solved problems, people called. As long as they carried the emotional burden, they were valued. But when exhaustion appears and they finally need support themselves, the response is often disappointing. Not always out of malice. Sometimes people simply became accustomed to receiving. They forgot the empath was human too. This is often the first major turning point. The moment when the empath begins questioning a belief they may have carried. Wide their entire life. The belief that their worth is tied to how much they can give. Because the truth is far more powerful. Human value does not come from endless sacrifice. It does not come from constant availability. It does not come from carrying burdens that were never yours to carry. Real strength is not measured by how much pain you can absorb, Real strength is measured by knowing when to stop absorbing it. And for the empath who has gone through too much, this realization becomes the beginning of a transformation. Before boundaries can be built, exhaustion must reveal why they are necessary. Before healing can begin, depletion must expose what has been ignored. And before a stronger version of the empath can emerge, the old belief that self-neglect is a virtue must finally be abandoned. Because the moment you stop measuring your value by how much of yourself you give away is the moment you begin reclaiming the life that was always yours to live. Once emotional exhausted, Eustion begins to reveal itself, something else starts to change, something deeper, and often more permanent. The empath's view of people begins to shift. This is one of the least discussed aspects of the empath's journey because it doesn't happen suddenly. It unfolds gradually, often over years. At first, the empath believes that if they care enough, understand enough, forgive enough, they can preserve almost any relationship. They approach people with openness. They give the benefit of the doubt. They search for explanations rather than accusations. When someone behaves badly, the empath often asks, "What happened to them?" rather than, "What's wrong with them?" This tendency comes from a genuine desire to understand human behavior. Empaths naturally look beneath the surface. They recognize that pain can create anger, insecurity can create arrogance, and fear can create control. They see the wounds behind the actions. In many ways, this is a remarkable strength, but there is a hidden danger in understanding people too well. Sometimes understanding becomes excusing, sometimes compassion becomes permission, and sometimes the desire to see the good in people causes someone to ignore what is actually happening right in front of them. One of the most difficult lessons an empath learns is that understanding someone's pain does not erase the consequences of their behavior. A person may have suffered greatly, they may have experienced trauma, they may have reasons for acting the way they do. All of that can be true, and they can still cause damage. This distinction becomes clearer with experience. In the beginning, many empaths interpret every disappointment as an isolated event. They assume misunderstandings. They assume good intentions. They assume that if they communicate clearly enough, everything will improve. Then life begins presenting patterns. The same broken promises, the same emotional manipulation, the same one-sided dynamics, the same people who take endlessly but rarely give. The same relationships where effort flows in one direction. And eventually the empath notices something important. Human behavior is often far more predictable than they once believed. Patterns reveal character more accurately than words. This realization can be uncomfortable because it forces the empath to abandon certain idealistic assumptions. They begin to understand that not everyone values honesty equally. Not everyone seeks mutual growth. Not everyone feels responsible for the impact they have on others. For someone whose worldview is built around empathy, this can feel almost shocking. Not because they become cynical, because they become realistic. There is a profound difference. Cynicism assumes the worst about everyone. Wisdom recognizes people as they are. And wisdom is usually purchased through disappointment. This is why many empaths who have gone through too much become noticeably quieter over time. People often misinterpret. Read this change, they assume the empath has become distant, cold, guarded. But what is actually happening is far more sophisticated. The empath is observing. They are no longer rushing to explain away every red flag. They are no longer filling in the gaps between someone's words and actions. They are paying attention, and attention changes everything. Psychologically speaking, human beings reveal themselves through consistency. Anyone can perform kindness occasionally. Anyone can make promises. Anyone can present a favorable image. But sustained behavior tells the truth. The empath who has experienced enough disappointment learns to trust patterns more than presentations. This doesn't mean they stop believing in people. It means they stop believing potential is the same thing as reality. That distinction alone can transform an entire life. Many unhealthy relationships survive because one person is constantly investing in who the other person could become rather than accept, upping who they currently are. Empaths are particularly vulnerable to this trap. They see possibilities everywhere. They see growth. They see hidden strengths. They see future versions of people. But eventually experience teaches them a difficult truth. You do not have a relationship with someone's potential. You have a relationship with their present behavior. And when that lesson finally settles in, the empath begins making different decisions. They stop chasing explanations. They stop arguing with reality. They stop trying to rescue people from consequences that those people continually create for themselves. This doesn't happen because they lose compassion. In fact, many become more compassionate than ever. The difference is that their compassion becomes informed by wisdom. They realize that helping someone and enabling someone are not the same thing. Listening and absorbing are not the same thing. Loving and sacrificing yourself are not the same thing. And Purha. P.S. Most importantly, understanding someone does not obligate you to remain within reach of their harmful behavior. This realization often marks the beginning of emotional maturity. Not because the empath becomes harder, because they become clearer. They begin recognizing that trust should be earned through consistency. Respect should be mutual. Effort should be reciprocal. And access to their emotional world should not be granted automatically. There is also a philosophical dimension to this transformation. When we are young, many of us unconsciously divide people into simple categories. Good people and bad people. Life eventually teaches us something more nuanced. Most people are neither heroes nor villains. They are simply operating at the limits of their awareness. Some are growing, some are avoiding growth, some are taking responsibility, some are avoiding responsibility. And those choices matter. The empath who has gone through too much begins evaluating people S by their intentions and more by their willingness to take responsibility for their actions. Because intentions can be invisible, responsibility can be observed. This creates a profound shift in relationships. The empath no longer feels compelled to convince others to change. They no longer feel responsible for carrying another person's emotional development. They recognize a simple truth: growth cannot be outsourced. Every individual must choose it for themselves. And when someone refuses to choose growth repeatedly, the empath stops volunteering to pay the price for that decision. This is not bitterness, it is discernment. It is the ability to see clearly without surrendering compassion. It is the wisdom that emerges when experience replaces illusion. And while this transformation can feel lonely at first, it ultimately creates something invaluable: freedom. Freedom from unnecessary guilt, freedom from endless rescue missions, freedom from relationships built on imitation. Balance. Because the moment you stop judging people by who they could become and start seeing them for who they consistently choose to be, you reclaim the power to protect your peace without abandoning your humanity. After the empath begins to see people more clearly, another transformation often follows. It is quieter than the others, less visible. In many cases, it happens without anyone around them fully understanding what is taking place. This is the stage where the empath starts to withdraw. Not dramatically, not with announcements, not with confrontation, silently. This is important to understand because many people expect emotional breaking points to look obvious. They imagine anger, arguments, emotional outbursts, or public declarations. But for the empath who has gone through too much, the opposite is usually true. The more pain they carry, the quieter they become. Part of this comes from experience. Empaths spend years explaining themselves. They communicate their needs. They express their concerns. They try to repair misunderstandings. They give people opportunities to understand what is hurting them. And after enough repetitions, many discover something uncomfortable. Not everyone is listening. Some people hear words but never absorb their meaning. Some people apologize without changing behavior. Some people acknowledge concerns only long enough to preserve access to the relationship. Eventually, the empath realizes that repeating the same truth over and over rarely creates different results. So they stop explaining, not because they have nothing to say, because they have already said it. One of the most misunderstood behaviors in psychology is withdrawal. People often assume withdrawal means weakness, avoidance, or emotional instability. In reality, withdrawal can sometimes be a highly rational response to prolonged emotional overload. The nervous system has limits. Every person has a threshold for disappointment, conflict, and labor. When those limits are exceeded repeatedly, the mind begins conserving energy. It starts reducing unnecessary emotional investment. This is not a conscious strategy at first. It is often an adaptive response. The empath gradually becomes less available. They answer fewer messages. They spend more time alone. They stop volunteering information. They become more selective about where their energy goes. To outside observers, this can appear confusing, especially to people who only knew the empath during their endlessly available phase. Those people often assume something is wrong, and in a sense, something is. The empath has finally recognized that the way they were living was unsustainable. What makes this period particularly significant is that it is often mistaken for temporary exhaustion when it may actually represent permanent change. There is a profound difference between an empath needing space and an empath emotionally checking out. When an empath needs space, they still feel connected. They still believe the relationship can be repaired. They are resting, recovering, regrouping. But when an empath emotionally checks out, something entirely different has occurred. The internal bond has already weakened. The emotional investment has already been withdrawn. The decision may not even be fully conscious yet, but it is happening beneath the surface. This is why so many people are caught off guard when an empath eventually leaves a relationship, friendship, or environment. To them, the departure feels sudden. To the empath, it happened months or years earlier. The physical departure is simply the final step in a process that has been unfolding internally for a very long time. Think about a tree. When a tree falls during a storm, observers often blame the final gust of wind. But the reality is that the weakening began long before. Decay occurred beneath the bark. Structural damage accumulated over time. The final gust mere lie revealed what was already true. The same principle applies to many empaths. People focus on the final event, the final argument, the final disappointment, the final betrayal. But those moments are rarely the true cause. They are simply the last piece of evidence in a much larger pattern. And once the empath reaches this stage, something fascinating happens psychologically. They begin reclaiming attention that was once directed entirely toward others. For years they studied everyone else's emotions. Now they begin studying their own. For years they monitored everyone else's needs. Now they begin asking what they need. For years they prioritized external harmony. Now they start pursuing internal peace. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first. Many empaths have spent so much of their lives defining themselves through service that self-focus feels unfamiliar. Sometimes it even feels selfish, but it isn't. There is a philosophical mistake that many highly empathetic people make. They assume that caring for themselves and caring for others exist in opposition, as if one must be sacrificed for the other. Yet the reality is exactly the opposite. Without self-preservation, empathy eventually collapses. Without boundaries, compassion becomes resentment. Without recovery, generosity becomes depletion. The empath who withdraws is often beginning to understand these truths at a deeper level. And this understanding changes how they interact with the world. They become harder to manipulate through guilt, harder to pressure through obligation, harder to control through emotional demands. Not because they have become indifferent, because they have become aware. Awareness changes everything. It allows a person to recognize when they are giving from genuine choice versus giving from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointing others, fear of appearing selfish. Once these fears lose their grip, the empath's behavior changes dramatically. They no longer feel compelled to attend every crisis. They no longer believe every problem is theirs to solve. They no longer confuse accessibility with love. This can create tension with people who benefited from the old version of the empath. Those individuals may accuse them of changing, and they are correct. The empath has changed. But change is not always loss. Sometimes change is evidence of growth. Sometimes the person who appears distant is simply becoming whole. Sometimes the withdrawal that others interpret as rejection is actually a return to self-respect. And perhaps this is the most important insight of all. The empath's silence is rarely empty. It is often filled with observation, reflection, and recalibration. What looks like isolation may actually be reconstruction. What looks like disappearance may actually be transformation. Because before an empath can become stronger, wiser, and more discerning, they often must step away from the noise long enough to hear themselves again. And the people who fear your silence the most are often the ones who benefited most from the version of you that never stopped giving. After the period of withdrawal, reflection, and emotional recalibration, the empath eventually arrives at a moment that changes everything. It does not always happen on a specific day. There is rarely a dramatic scene. In fact, many people don't recognize it while it is happening. But psychologically, it is one of the most significant turning points in the entire journey. It is the breaking point. Not the kind of breaking point people usually imagine. Not collapse, not defeat, transformation. There is a profound difference between being broken by life and being changed by it. The empath who has gone through too much eventually reaches a limit. A point where the old way of operating no longer works. The endless explaining, the constant sacrificing, the repeated forgiveness without accountability, the habit of carrying responsibilities that belong to other people, all of it begins to feel impossible to continue. For years, they may have believed that endurance was strength. If they could tolerate more, forgive more, understand more, then somehow everything would improve. But reality has a way of testing beliefs. And one of the hardest lessons reality teaches is that tolerance alone does not create healthy relationships. In fact, excessive tolerance often attracts unhealthy dynamics. When boundaries are absent, people learn what they can get away with. When consequences never appear, behavior rarely changes. And when someone continuously sacrifices themselves to maintain peace, they unintentionally teach others that their needs can be ignored. This realization is often painful because it forces the empath to confront something uncomfortable. Many of the patterns they experienced were not solely created by other people. Some were sustained by their own inability to establish limits. That's true. This is difficult because it shifts attention inward. It requires responsibility. Not responsibility for what others did, but responsibility for what was allowed to continue. This is where genuine transformation begins. Psychologically speaking, every major personal evolution requires the death of an old identity. Something familiar must be released before something stronger can emerge. For the empath, that old identity is often the people pleaser, the rescuer, the emotional caretaker, the person who feels responsible for everyone's comfort. For years, this identity may have provided purpose. It may have created acceptance. It may have even felt noble. But eventually the empath begins noticing a troubling pattern. The more they abandon themselves for others, the less connected they feel to themselves. And no amount of external approval can compensate for internal abandonment. This realization creates tension. Because growth is rarely comfortable, growth requires the empath to do things that once felt unnatural, to say no, to disappoint people, to stop explaining decisions that require no explanation, to allow others to experience the consequences of their own choices, to walk away from situations they once would have stayed in indefinitely. These actions may seem simple from the outside. Internally, they can feel revolutionary. Why? Because many empaths are conditioned to associate self-respect with selfishness. Somewhere along the way, they learned that being good meant being available. Being kind meant being accommodating. Being loving meant endless sacrifice. But mature wisdom begins to challenge these assumptions. A person can be compassionate and still have boundaries. A person can be generous and still protect their time. A person can love deeply and still refuse mistreatment. In fact, these qualities often become stronger once boundaries exist. Without boundaries, kindness becomes obligation. With boundaries, kindness becomes choice. And there is a world of difference between the two. One of the most fascinating aspects of this transformation is how other people respond to it. Not everyone celebrates the empath's growth. Some resist it. Some criticize it. Some accuse the empath of becoming cold, distant, selfish, or different. And in many cases, these reactions reveal something important. People who genuinely care about your well-being usually adapt to healthy boundaries. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries often struggle with them. This distinction becomes incredibly revealing. The empath begins seeing relationships through a new lens, not based on who demands access, but based on who respects limits. Not based on who needs them most, but based on who values mutual respect. For perhaps the first time, they stop measuring relationships by how much they can give. Instead, they begin evaluating relationships by their balance, their reciprocity, their health. This shift change ease everything, because once the empath develops self-respect, manipulation loses much of its power. Guilt becomes less effective. Pressure becomes less effective. Emotional blackmail becomes less effective. The old buttons no longer work because the internal programming has changed. And this is where the breaking point reveals its true purpose. It was never meant to destroy the empath. It was meant to wake them up. Philosophically, suffering often functions as a teacher, not because suffering is inherently good, but because it forces confrontation with reality. It strips away illusions. It exposes weaknesses in our beliefs. It reveals what can no longer continue. The empath's breaking point serves exactly this function. It exposes the cost of self-neglect. It reveals the consequences of endless emotional availability. It demonstrates the difference between love and obligation. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches the empath that preserving themselves is not a bet. Rail of others. It is a responsibility. This realization creates a level of confidence that looks very different from the confidence people typically imagine. It is not loud. It does not seek attention. It does not need validation. Instead, it manifests as clarity. The empath knows what they will tolerate. They know what they will no longer tolerate. They know where their responsibilities end and where someone else's begin. And that clarity creates peace. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because confusion disappears. The constant internal conflict begins to fade. The need to justify every decision fades. The fear of disappointing everyone fades. In its place emerges something far more powerful: self-trust, the ability to trust your perception, trust your instincts, trust your boundaries, trust your right to protect your energy. And when an empath reaches this stage, people often mistake the transformation for hardness. But it is not hardness. It is alignment. The heart remains open. Compassion remains intact. Empathy remains alive. The difference is that these gifts are no longer available at the expense of the self. Because the most important lesson the empath learns at their breaking point is this: the moment you stop sacrificing your peace to keep others comfortable is the moment your healing truly begins. After the breaking point, after the exhaustion, the disappointment, the withdrawal, and the painful reconstruction of identity, something remarkable begins to emerge. It is not the old empath. That version is gone. The person who believed every problem was theirs to solve, every burden was theirs to carry, and every relationship was theirs to save has been transformed by experience. What emerges instead is perhaps the strongest version of the empath that has ever existed. And what makes this stage so fascinating is that, from the outside, it can appear contradictory. The empath becomes both softer and stronger, or compassionate and more selective, more understanding and less tolerant. At first glance, those qualities seem incompatible, but they are not. They are the result of wisdom. One of the greatest misconceptions about emotional growth is the belief that hardship makes people cold. Certainly, some people become bitter after suffering. Some become cynical. Some close themselves off completely. But that is not the only path. For many empaths, pain serves a different purpose. It refines them. The difference between a naive empath and a wise empath is not the amount of compassion they possess. It is the amount of discernment that accompanies it. The naive empath believes everyone deserves unlimited access. The wise empath understands that compassion and access are not the same thing. This distinction changes everything. Earlier in life, the empath may have measured success by how much they could give, how available they could be, how many people they could help, how many problems they could solve. But eventually they discover a truth that philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual teachers have pointed toward for centuries. A meaningful life is not built by endlessly giving yourself away. A meaningful life is built through alignment. Alignment between your values and your actions. Alignment between what you believe and what you tolerate. Alignment between how you care for others and how you care for yourself. Without this alignment, even noble intentions eventually create suffering. With it, life begins to feel different. One of the first things that changes is the empath's relationship with validation. For years, many empaths unconsciously seek approval through usefulness. They become indispensable because being needed feels secure. If people need you, they stay. If people rely on you, they appreciate you. If people depend on you, they value you. At least that is what the mind often assumes. But experience eventually reveals the weakness. In that strategy. Need is not the same as love. Dependence is not the same as respect. And usefulness is not the same as genuine connection. The empath who has gone through too much eventually stops chasing validation through service. Not because they stop helping, because they stop needing their worth to be proven through helping. This is a profound psychological shift. For the first time, their identity becomes internal rather than external. Their value no longer rises and falls based on someone else's opinion. Their peace no longer depends on constant approval. Their self-respect no longer depends on being indispensable. And this creates an extraordinary sense of freedom. Freedom to say no without guilt. Freedom to walk away without endless explanations. Freedom to choose relationships rather than cling to them. Freedom to remain kind without becoming available to every demand placed upon them. This is where many people misunderstand the evolved empath. Observers often notice the boundaries but fail to recognize the deeper change underneath them. The boundary itself is not the transformation. The self-respect that created the boundary is the transformation. Because healthy boundaries are not walls. They are filters. Walls keep everyone out. Filters allow the right people in. The empath finally understands this distinction. They are no longer interested in proving their goodness through self-sacrifice. They are interested in protecting the conditions that allow genuine connection to flourish. And that requires selectivity. Not everyone earns trust. Not everyone earns access. Not everyone earns proximity to your inner world. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it challenges a common cultural narrative. Many people believe unconditional acceptance means unconditional access. But psychologically, these are entirely different concepts. You can accept people as they are while still deciding they are not healthy for your life. You can understand someone's struggles while refusing to become responsible for them. You can wish someone well without accompanying them on their journey. The wise empath learns all of these lessons. And as a result, their relationships become fewer in number but deeper in quality. The constant noise begins to disappear. The endless drama loses its appeal. The need to rescue everyone fades. What remains is authenticity. Connection built on mutual respect rather than dependency. Support built on reciprocity rather than obligation. Love built on choice rather than guilt. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this transformation is that empathy itself survives. Many people fear that if they become stronger, they will become less caring. If they establish boundaries, they will become selfish. If they protect themselves, they will lose their humanity. The opposite is usually true. When empathy is no longer burdened by exhaustion, it becomes clear. When compassion is no longer distorted by people-pleasing, it becomes healthier. When kindness is no longer motivated by fear of rejection, it becomes genuine. The empath discovers that protecting their peace does not diminish their ability to love. It strengthens it, because now their compassion comes from abundance rather than depletion. Their generosity comes from choice rather than pressure. Their presence comes from desire rather than obligation. This is the final evolution, not the abandonment of empathy, the mastery of it. The ability to remain open-hearted in a world that sometimes rewards cynicism. The ability to remain compassionate without becoming consumed. The ability to care deeply without carrying what was never yours to carry. And perhaps that is what the entire journey has been preparing the empath to understand. The pain was never meant to teach them how to stop loving. It was meant to teach them how to love wisely. Because the strongest empath is not the one who sacrifices themselves for everyone else. The strongest empath is the one who has learned that protecting their own peace is what allows their compassion to endure for a lifetime.